Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. I'm very happy that you are here. I'm very happy that I am here. This is definitely worth missing another one-on-one for. This is a session with Mel Graham called Action Under Uncertainty in Long-Termism and Wild Animal Welfare. I will not tell you too much more about the session. I think it's better to spend our time just listening to Mel, and I will also not describe everything about their bio. You can find that in Swapcard. Also in Swapcard is where you ask your questions. This is a pretty short session, and I also have questions, so we might not get to all of yours, but there are office hours right after this, next door, I think, in the East Ballroom. Is that correct? That is correct. And if you don't have time to go to that and still have questions, still ask them. I think it will be very helpful for Mel to see what people are wondering about. Let's see, is there anything else that you need to know? Swap card, office hours. No, that's it. So I will just tell you that Mal is a postdoc at NYU working on wild animal welfare and also the strategy director at Wild Animal Initiative. Welcome, Mel.
Thank you very much, Steen. Okay, so before I start, I just want to note that I have benefited greatly from the input of several others in developing this work, though the views presented here, of course, my own, especially the bad ones. Okay, so when I think about what makes effective altruism special, two key concepts stand out to me. One is cost effectiveness, and this is the idea that we're trying to maximize the impact per unit of resources that we have. And the second is impartial altruism, which means we don't privilege particular groups. We consider any intervention that substantially benefits sentient beings, regardless of their location, their species, or even when they exist in time. These principles have helped generate several EA cause areas. Today I'll be focusing on wild animal welfare and long-termism. Wild animal welfare comes from the idea that because there are so many wild animals and their welfare is so deeply neglected, there could be really cost-effective interventions to improve their lives, and it's worth spending at least some time trying to identify what these might be. Long-termism follows from the idea that probably the majority of sentient life exists in the future, and so even modest improvements in the trajectory of that future could be a cost-effective way of doing good, or, depending on your philosophy, maybe the most effective way of doing good. Both these cause areas are severely neglected. And when we combine neglectedness with scale, we get another issue, which is uncertainty. Wild animals, for example, live in a complex web of interactions, and we don't always know how improving the welfare at one node in that web will change the web overall. Long-termism seems even more complicated because we repeat this picture throughout the future. I find uncertainty particularly interesting within the context of justification. When we know for sure that a few things are good to do, we can relatively easily, I mean not that easily, but kind of easily, weigh up their cost effectiveness and decide what we want to work on that basis. But when there's uncertainty, we need some set of criteria by which we decide that we are justified in our choice to act on this or act on that. And I want to be careful here to distinguish theoretical from social justification. In the first case, this is kind of an aspect of decision theory, and we're thinking about things like how do you represent your uncertainty, how do you update your beliefs, how do you make sequential decisions. I think the theory behind this stuff is very interesting and very important, and I am not an expert in it, so it is not what I'm talking about today. Instead, I want to focus on social justification. No human is a perfect practitioner of any decision theory, so we mostly use heuristics and rule of thumb. And our communities also play a big role by providing social endorsement and support, or not. And as a result, justification approaches can feed back and influence many features of how a community behaves. And it's that last aspect that I'm particularly interested in. What are the on-the-ground social impacts of different heuristics that we happen to choose? I think social justification is really hard to achieve in wild animal welfare, in large part because of fear of backfire risks. So what's a backfire risk? That's the idea that we might have a promising but uncertain intervention, and that when we look at it carefully, it also has some negative effects. And an intervention backfires if the negative effects are actually bigger than the positive effects we were hoping to achieve. And to make this very concrete, I'm just going to share an example from a context I'm particularly familiar with, which is the issue of bird window collisions. So if you're not familiar, a bird window collision is an issue in which birds are not very good at understanding what they're seeing when they see a reflection in a pane of glass. And if that reflection reflects a tree, they may try to fly to that reflected tree thinking it's an object they can land on. And as a result, they hit the glass. And when they hit the glass, they can be moving at pretty meaningful speeds, and many of them can die or be severely injured. There is a nice prevention mechanism, which is bird-safe glass. This is where you put stickers or films. Sometimes you can actually manufacture glass with like fritting built into the glass so that birds can see it or don't see reflections, and so they don't fly into the glass. So the question is this a good thing to do from a wild animal welfare perspective? The uncertainty arises at the cost-effectiveness side on how many of these collisions actually happen. Like maybe it's bad they're happening, but maybe we don't know that they're cost-effective because we don't know how many of them there are. In particular, we don't know what the outcomes are. Some birds might fly away, basically unaffected. Some are injured to varying degrees, and some die from their injuries. And unfortunately, we don't really have good data on the relative ratios of different kinds of outcomes from bird window collisions. We also particularly don't know for injured birds how many of them kind of recover relatively quickly after their injury and how many of them die as a result of their injuries. So now let me introduce the part where, depending on your philosophical views, you might start worrying about backfire risk. For the birds who either aren't affected or injured and recover, it seems kind of hard to imagine how the risk would backfire. But for birds who die, how the intervention would backfire. But for birds who die, we have to remember that protecting them from a single collision does not make them immortal. So we are buying them some extra time, after which they are still going to die, maybe from something like a disease or by being eaten by a predator. So under some philosophical views that are predominant within EA, the question becomes, is the expected value of the time we gain them by preventing them from having that collision better than the expected value of the difference in suffering between their new death and their old death? If it isn't, it seems like maybe the intervention will backfire by creating more suffering than it prevents. The really hairy uncertainty, though, starts when you begin to wonder whether or not bird window collisions influence population sizes, either overall or even within a particular season, because the ways birds interact with other species depends on what season they're in. If it does, this will affect all the animals who eat birds and the animals with whom birds compete, as well as on all the animals that birds eat. And I'm sorry, here we had a little Mac to Windows translation problem with emojis, so imagine that that's an insect. And that has some meaningful chance of affecting plants. And if we affect plants, that's going to affect the whole ecosystem. And that is definitely going to affect wild animal welfare, but we have no idea how. So we don't know for sure that it backfires, but we also don't know for sure that it doesn't. If you're anything like me, after listening to me walk through that chain of reasoning, you're starting to feel like this guy. It's not a good feeling. So of course we might wonder, is there some way to work on causes with high complexity and high uncertainty that don't require these kinds of assessments where we end up in a place we're totally clueless? And here's where I kind of turn to long-termism in the hopes of getting some inspiration. It seems like long-termists should have some similar problems. They're trying to influence the trajectory of the long-term future while doing things that seem likely to have indirect effects of some kind or another, some of which even affect wild animals. But it doesn't seem obvious that they're really held back by backfire risk. If we look, for example, at the top 5 pressing problems highlighted by 80,000 hours, long-termist-oriented people have identified working on AI safety, stopping engineered pandemics, and reducing great power conflict as all good to act on. To figure out more about how uncertainty is handled in those domains, I've had a number of conversations with people in the long-termist space over the last couple of months, and I've also read a lot of material. And thinking about that and wild animal welfare together, I've kind of come up with maybe 3 broad approaches people seem to be taking. And I'm going to go through these. The first approach I'm calling spotlighting. This view holds that you should think about backfire risk, but it's okay to spotlight the target moral patients that you're considering and ignore other kinds of risks. So let's say I'm a long-termist, and so I'm holding in my spotlight issues that affect humans over the long-term future, or maybe if that's not what motivates me for AI risk, whatever AI is going to do to humans the next 30 years, say. And so I'm going to worry about backfire of maybe, let's say, an AI policy, like a regulatory policy. I'm going to wonder, what if I pass a policy in the US and it works really well for AI safety here, but it somehow backfires by making AI less safe in China? That's a maybe intuitive kind of backfire risk you could imagine in the AI space. I'm not, you'll notice though, worrying about backfire risks on other cause areas. I'm just talking about backfire on my intended outcome. I think a reasonable question for people using this approach is, how does this reflect the impartiality that attracted a lot of us to EA in the first place? If I'm impartial, shouldn't it be not possible to separate the effects of AI policy on AI risk from the effects of that policy on other groups? And so we might imagine that this inseparability would force us to at least consider animals in addition to humans. 3 possible responses to that complaint are that actually animals don't matter, that my policy is not going to have any effect on animals, or that yes, it'll have some effects, but the target effects dominate, and so we just can neglect those to one side. First, I think saying animals don't matter is just obviously incorrect. We have tons of evidence that many species are sentient, and I don't think anyone really acts like their pet dog is not a moral patient or sentient at all. So I'm not going to spend much time on that view, even though I think it is extremely prevalent, consciously or subconsciously. So let's turn to the idea that long-termist interventions just don't affect wild animals. Unfortunately, I think this is also clearly wrong in most cases. If we take, for example, some policy designed to slow down AI for the purpose of making it safer, that's going to change the long-term future in some ways. But it also changes ecosystems in the near term, because it influences land use, rates of water consumption, mining practices, just to name a few things that might change as a result of AI policy. And that definitely changes ecosystems, and that definitely affects wild animal welfare, and we definitely do not know how. So a small pivot would be to say, sure, interventions in other cause areas affect wild animals, just as an example, but those effects are minuscule when you compare them to the effects on the target beneficiaries. I don't fully understand this view because I think it would be extremely hard to prove. I don't know how I would weigh up the effects of AI policy on long-termism versus mining practices now on wild animals, given that I don't know what the effects on wild animals are at all. But I think what's happening here is that someone who's has this mindset is thinking indirect effects are really hard to analyze, so I'm just actually talking about direct effects when I say this. I have some qualms about that, but I think we can see where it goes. If you're okay with that option, maybe now it looks totally sensible that wild animal welfare is way harder to work on than other cause areas. Because when I have wild animal welfare in my spotlight, I have every wild animal species in my spotlight. And so even if I am neglecting AI risk to humans or issues to farmed animals that could backfire from my wild animal intervention, I'm setting those in the dark, then that's only setting aside 1 or maybe up to a few hundred species. There's 2.1 million described wild animal species, and I don't know how many undescribed. So we can see, obviously that would make it more complicated. But if this is an allowed move, I think an obvious question is, what is a cause area? This grouping of moral patients is totally arbitrary. So what if instead of trying to work on wild animal welfare, I'm just working on wild bird welfare? So now wild birds are in my spotlight of partiality, and all these other animals are out. I don't have to think about the backfire risks to other animals or to humans. Even if I do this, it doesn't even reduce the cost effectiveness very much. The literature estimates suggest that up to 1 billion birds are killed annually in North America from bird window collisions. If that's right, my current model suggests that legislation to reduce bird window collisions, analyzed in this sort of spotlighting way, could be cost competitive with corporate welfare campaigns for chickens. So I think there's an important and deep question here about what is getting in our spotlight and what isn't, and the philosophical grounds by which we're doing that. Even so, let's say this is one option to handling uncertainty that we could at least apply consistently, even if it has kind of weird results. We can point our spotlights to moral patient groups, keep on as we have been in long-termism, but start working on smaller buckets of animals in wild animal welfare. I give this option a meh rating. It's an improvement over the current baseline in that it's trying to be consistent across cause areas, but I think it just seems really weird when you apply it to wild animal welfare. It would make my life easier, personally, but I don't like an approach that gives such different answers based on pretty arbitrary groupings of moral patients. So let's go back to our options list. The next idea is that we can set aside our cluelessness somehow. 2 approaches to doing so are sort of to assign super precise probabilities to everything, even things we're uncertain about, or treating our cluelessness as neutral in expectation. The first of these, the precise probabilities approach, involves thinking of all the possible effects I can come up with and forcing myself to assign precise probabilities to all of them. I might also add in some factor to account for my unknown unknowns. I think a lot of people kind of think this is what they're doing when they do a cost effectiveness analysis. First, I think there's a good bit of writing on this topic that makes me uncomfortable with the approach from the theory side, specifically how arbitrary it is to assign precise probabilities when your uncertainty is so wide. But from a social perspective, I think there's another issue, which is that you end up being subject to really extreme swings in the things you recommend. For example, maybe today my precise probability assignments lead me to believe that this AI policy is net positive, even when I consider the effects on wild animals. But maybe I learned something new in 3 months, and because my uncertainty was so profound, that new knowledge I learned could totally change my precise probabilities, and now I think it's net negative. And so like today on the EA forum, I'm posting this policy yes, tomorrow on the EA forum, I'm posting this policy no, and that just seems like a really weird way to end up operating. Even if your decision theory endorses changing your mind all the time, when I'm thinking about the social consequences to the community, you end up like totally undirected and end up not being able to make a difference. I think you can also see this within a cause area, not within a single person, but between groups. You'll have like one group of people weighing up their precise probabilities in such a way that they're like, yes, AI accelerationism, we're gonna usher in utopia. And on the other side of the community, you're like, definitely not, pause AI, we're like about to bring in the apocalypse. And that's sort of what happens when you just end up in a position where you have to assign precise probabilities to something that you really don't understand at all. So another approach would be to say, look, I am totally clueless about, just as an example, the population and ecological consequences of my AI policy. I'm going to set it aside as neutral in expectation. I think this has some problems, again, from the theory side, that you can actually read about. I recommend, for example, Anthony DiGiovanni's sequence on cluelessness. That's available on the EA forum if you're interested. But again, I'm going to focus on a social issue, which is I think that when you set aside your cluelessness so easily, it results in an emotional knowledge penalty. Okay, just to illustrate that idea, imagine this bucket is where I put my cluelessness. These are the things I'm going to treat as EV neutral because I'm so clueless about them. If it's in the bucket, I don't need to assign probabilities to it to complete my cost-effectiveness analysis. I'm clueless about it. But that means that the more ignorant I am, the more things I get to put in the bucket. The more research I do, the more I have to pull things out of my bucket and start estimating them. And my estimates are going to be rough and uncomfortable because it feels bad to put precise probabilities on things I know I'm pretty uncertain about, where a probability of 3% feels just as valid as 10 or 20. So it was easier for me to feel justified about acting or not acting on bird-safe glass, for example, when I knew less but was ignoring my cluelessness, which seems like a bad outcome. I don't want my heuristics to disincentivize research aimed at addressing deep uncertainty. There's a lot of complicated things I could talk about here more that I don't have time for, but I think this is like a complicated social point. But what happens if we take option 2 anyway, despite these concerns I've raised? I think, like spotlighting, setting aside cluelessness somehow is pretty common, and we can see that some of the social outcomes that approach appearing in different ways in both wild animal welfare and AI safety. It means some people are recommending very different things, either from themselves a few months ago or from other people in their own community because of inappropriately strong commitments to different probability models. And I think it has resulted in too little research. Not overall, I think EA does plenty of research overall, but specifically research on the things we are most deeply uncertain about, even when those things are actually kind of like cruxy for the things we're working on. So as a result, I give this option a thumbs down for community level effects. So, but if I'm right, what are we left with? The final approach I'll discuss is the galaxy-brained approach. And under this view, we accept the profoundness of our uncertainty, and we accept that impartiality means we can't conveniently separate out long-termist effects and wild animal welfare effects. If we do this, though, we start asking for every possible cause area to consider, for every possible intervention they might work on, how does this thing affect all sentient life, both now and into the far future? And that is very hard to do. In galaxy brain mode, as a result, because of how difficult it is to answer these questions, we might use a final approach to handling uncertainty, which is to accept that it's a really big problem and try to find special interventions that have no population or ecological consequences. I'll call this approach trying to find ecologically inert interventions. So as soon as something like an AI policy or bird-safe glass intervention has population-level consequences, it's out. We're not going to work on that. We're going to look for something else. Few interventions have passed this bar, but there are some. Like maybe humans are already killing animals this way, and we could kill the exact same animals a slightly different way, and so there's no ecosystem effects, but we somehow reduce the suffering. Okay, that might be on the table. But it does mean that we're focusing a lot on research to try to find these vanishingly small number of interventions that have no ecological consequences. And the other thing I'll point out is that even though we've kind of been working with this mindset quite a bit in wild animal welfare, is that no one else uses this mindset. And so it just seems like a little unfair. Not to complain about my own community, but it does seem like it would be worthwhile to think through what does it mean if we try to apply this lens in other kinds of cause areas. I don't see people working on global health going like, oh no, what are the ecological consequences of my global health intervention? So now we have all of our options. Option 3 means entering galaxy brain mode, and in both wild animal welfare and long-termism, we would start needing to think about all of these complicated effects. And so everybody would think like Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, not just me. As a result, I worry that we would sort of as a community end up stuck doing nothing. And again, depending on your philosophy, you might be okay with that, but I have a slight bias towards action. I want to do things to try to make the world better, even if some of them backfire, because I want to learn from what I do and improve and iterate. So again, I like that the galaxy brain approach feels philosophically strong. Like, it seems like you're really going down to the grain there and trying to be consistent, but I am worried about that it's setting too high a bar for action. So this brings us to the conclusion of my talk, which is that I think we need more research on decision theory and the heuristics we use for justification. If this is your option space, I think you need to try to find more options. We can do this by looking for new theories or heuristics, ideally at ones that allow us to find some middle ground, perhaps, between galaxy-brained and spotlighting approaches. And I'd like to point to a recent paper by Jesse Clifton and co-authors putting forward the idea of bracketing. I'm not necessarily endorsing their particular theory, although there's many things I like about it, but what I love is that they're trying. We're trying to think about decision theory like rigorously and find consistent approaches that make sense to use. So I'd love it if more people were involved in that conversation. But maybe you think that the current heuristics we have are fine. If so, I still think we need at least some discussion to identify better justifications for these approaches, and also perhaps to begin applying them more equally across cause areas, either going galaxy-brained for long-termism or accepting spotlighting as appropriate in wild animal welfare. So to close with a summary, I've shared that the available options to handling deep uncertainty I'm aware of are spotlighting, setting aside your cluelessness, and going galaxy-brained. I've argued that all of these approaches seem to have some problems, and even if you accept those issues, they are not being applied evenly across EA cause areas. But the outcome of applying them evenly seems unlikely to be accepted by either long-termists or wild animal welfare practitioners. And as a result, I think we need to look for more options and keep thinking about the problem. So in terms of next steps, we can work to find better justifications for spotlighting or come to terms with it in wild animal welfare, look for different heuristics that will change how we approach both cause areas, or perhaps accept the galaxy-brained approach and decide that the only viable thing to do is more wild animal welfare research to identify ecologically inert interventions. I have a lot more thoughts on this topic that I'd love to discuss it more with anyone who's interested, so please come to my office hours.
Thank you. I am now still convinced that this would be a better place for me to live in if there were more people like you, so thank you for doing this. We have very little time left, so I'm going to use that time for a question that is very beneficial to me personally, and ignore yours for now. So I work for Animal Charity Evaluators, and a while ago we funded DC Voters for Animals, who used that money, among other things, to get an ordinance in place for bird-safe glass. So I would like to know a little bit more about this topic and if we made a good grant or not. Can you briefly share why you think that bird-safe, or why bird window collisions might or might not have population effects?
So the obvious reason they would have population effects is that people think they're killing 1 billion birds a year in North America. And so the question might be, how can you kill 1 billion birds a year and not have population level effects? One answer is that I think that estimate is actually slightly high. But another answer is that the vast majority of birds who have these collisions are hatch-year birds. And something like 80%, depending on what species you're talking about, of hatch-year birds die anyway. So it's not that if you stop them from having a bird window collision, they're going on and reproducing and massively increasing the population size. Instead, in the vast majority of cases, what's going on is that they're getting eaten. But they lived a little longer before that happened. And so there are also older birds who have these collisions as well, and there I think it's less uncertain exactly what's going on. And the problem is there's extremely low research on the ecological consequences. I've tried to do a literature review of this. I think maybe there's like 700 papers on bird window collisions, and like 75% of them are doing the same study in different places of counting how many birds are killed by a given building. And while that is interesting and helps you understand the deadly collision rates, it doesn't tell you the non-deadly collision rates, and it also does not tell you about ecological consequences. And as far as I'm aware, like only 1 or 2 papers have tried to quantify population level effects by correlating sort of baseline population studies with bird window collisions, and they found no effect. People argue about that. It's only 1 paper. A lot of the bird window collision scientists are like, surely there's an effect, but so far someone hasn't found one. So I think it's really up in the air whether it backfires or not, and I have several ideas for studies we could do to try to pin that down.
Okay, more research. Good. You know what? I think we can ask one more super quick question. I don't know if the answer is also quick. So how does all of this discussion apply to AI people who don't identify as long-termists?
Yeah. So I think I chose long-termism because it's the way of like looking at AI risks that I'm familiar with. But I do think that even if you're into AI not for long-termist reasons, just because you think like AI going badly could harm like 8 billion humans in the near-term future, I still think there's a problem where you're either spotlighting out wild animals, and then I wonder like what your reason is, or like the interventions you are choosing will still affect more than 8 billion animals within the next 5 years. I don't think the long-termist framing is required to have this issue. So I think it's like, yeah, you're passing a policy now. It's probably going to change something in the next 30 years that probably affects wild animal welfare, and you probably have no idea what that is. I don't know. Again, I'm not saying like, oh, definitely everyone should be galaxy-brained. I don't know. I'm just saying that it doesn't seem obvious why, depending on what framework you're using for handling your uncertainty, that it's not a problem for you.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone else. Again, yes.